Behemoth, or The Long, Long Parlement, by Thomas Hobbes, born 1588, perished 1679. Publication date 1889. Dialogue 1. If in time and place there were degrees of high and low, I verily believe that the highest of time would be that of which passed between the years of 1640 and 1660. For he that then, as from the Devil's Mountain, should have looked upon the world and observed the actions of man, especially in England, might have had a prospect of all kinds of injustice and of all kinds of folly that the world could afford, and how they were produced by that damned hypocrisy and self-conceit, whereof the one is double iniquity and the other double folly. I should be glad to behold that prospect, you that have lived in that time and in that part of your age wherein men used to see the best into good and evil. I pray you set me that could not then see so well upon the same Devil Mountain by the relation of the actions you then saw, and of their causes, pretentious, justice, order, artifice, and event. In the year 1640, the government of England was monarchical, and the king that reigned, Charles I of that name, holding that sovereignty by right of a descent, continued above 600 years, and from a much longer descent, King of Scotland, and from the time of his ancestors. Henry II, King of Ireland, a man that wanted no virtue, either of body or mind, nor endeavored anything more than to discharge his duty towards God in the well-governing of his subjects. How could he then miscarry, having in every county so many trained soldiers that were put together, have made an army of 16,000 men, and diverse magazines of ammunition in places fortified? If those soldiers had been as they and all other of his subjects ought to have been at his Majesty's command, the peace and happiness of the three kingdoms that continued as it was left by King James, but the people were corrupted generally, and disobedient persons esteemed the best patriots. But sure, there were men enough besides those that were ill affected. If those soldiers had been as they and all other of his subjects ought to have been at his Majesty's command, and the peace and happiness of the three kingdoms had continued as it was left by King James, but the people were corrupted generally, and disobedient persons esteemed the best patriots. But sure, there were men enough besides those that were ill affected to have made an army sufficient to have kept the people from uniting into a body able to oppose him. Truly, I think if the king had had money, he might have had soldiers enough in England, for there were very few of the common people that cared much for either of the causes that would have taken any side for pay or plunder. But the king's treasury was very low, and his enemies had pretended the people's ease from taxes and other spacious things had the command of the purses of the city of London, and of most cities and corporate towns of England, and of many particular persons besides. But how came the people to be so corrupted? And what kind of people were they that could so seduce them? The seducers were of diverse sorts. One sort were ministers. Ministers ministers, as they called themselves, of Christ, and sometimes in their sermons to the people, God's ambassadors, pretending to have a right from God to govern everyone, his parish and his assembly, their assembly, the whole nation. Secondly, there were a very great number, though not comparable to the other, which, notwithstanding that the Pope's power in England, both temporal and ecclesiastical, had been by acts of Parliament abolished, did still retain a belief that we ought to be governed by the Pope, whom they pretended to be the vicar of Christ, and in the right of Christ to be the governor of all Christian people. And these were known by the name of Papists, as the ministers I mentioned before were commonly called Presbyterians. Thirdly, there were not a few who in the beginning of the troubles were not discovered, but shortly after declared themselves for a liberty in religion, and those of different opinions one from another. See of them, because they would have all congregations free and independent upon one another, were called independents. Others that held baptism to infants, and such as understood not into what they were baptized, they are baptized to be ineffectual, were called therefore Anabaptists. Other that held that Christ's kingdom was at this time to begin upon the earth, were called Fifth Monarchy men. Besides diverse other sects as Quakers, Adamites, etc., whose names and peculiar doctrines I do not well remember. And these were the enemies which arose against his majesty from the private interpretation of the scripture, exposed to every man scanning in his mother tongue. Fourthly, there were an exceeding great number of men of the better sort, that had been so educated as that in their youth, having read the books written by famous men of the ancient Grecian, the Greeks, the Roman commonwealths concerning their polity, and great actions, in which books the popular government was extolled by the glorious name of liberty, and monarchy disgraced by the name of tyranny. They became hereby in love with their forms of government. And out of these men were chosen the greatest part of the House of Commons, or if they were not the greatest part, yet by advantage of their eloquences were always able to sway the rest. Fifthly, the city of London and other great towns of trade, having in operation the great prosperity of the Low Countries after they had revolted from their monarch, the King of Spain, were inclined to think that the like change of government here would to them produce the like prosperity. Sixthly, there were a very great number that had either wasted their fortunes or forced them to mean for the good parts which they thought were in themselves, and more there were that had able bodies, but saw no means how honestly to get their bread. These longed for a war, and hoped to maintain themselves thereafter by the lucky choosing of a path to side with, and consequently did for the most part serve under them. that had the greatest plenty of money. Lastly, the people in general were so ignorant of their duty as that no one perhaps of 10,000 knew what right any man had to command him, or what necessity there was for a king or commonwealth for which he was to be part of with his money against his will, but thought himself to be so much master of whatsoever he possessed, that it could not be taken from him upon any pretense of common safety without his own consent. King, they thought, was but a title of the highest honor, which gentleman, knight, baron, earl, duke were but steps to ascend to, with the help of riches. They had no rule of equity, but precedence and custom, and he was thought wisest and fittest to be chosen for a parliament that was most averse to the granting of subsidies of other public payments. In such a constitution of people, methinks the king is already ousted of his government, so as they needed not have taken arms for it. For I cannot imagine how the king should come by any means to resist them. There was indeed very great difficulty in the business, but of that point you will be the better informed on the pursuit of this narration. But I desire to know first the several grounds of the pretenses both of the Pope and of the Presbyterians, to which they claim a right to govern us, as they do in chief, and after that, from whence and when crept in the pretenses of the so long Parliament for a democracy. As for the Baptists, they challenge this right from a text in Deuteronomy 18:12 and other like texts according to the Old Latin translation in these words: "And he that out of pride shall refuse to obey the commandment of the priest, which shall be at that time minister before the Lord thy God, that man shall be by the sentence of the judge to put to death." And because, as the Jews were the people of God then, so is all Christendom the people of God now. They infer from thence that the Pope, whom they pretend to be the high priest of all Christian people, ought also to be obeyed in his decrees by all Christians upon pain of death. Again, whereas in the New Testament, Matthew 28:18-20, Christ saith, "All power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. Go therefore and teach all nations, and baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, and teach them to observe all these things which I have commanded you." From thence they infer that the command of the apostles was to be obeyed, and by the consequences the nations were bound to be governed by them, and especially by the prince of the apostles, St. Peter, and by his successors, the popes of Rome. For the text in the Old Testament, I do not see how the commandment of God to the Jews to obey their priests can be interpreted to have the like force in the case of other nations Christian, more than upon nations unchristian, for all the worlds are God's people, unless we also grant that the king cannot of an infidel be made Christian without making himself subject to the laws of that apostle, or priest or minister that shall convert him. The Jews were a very peculiar people of God, a sacerdotal kingdom, and bound to no other law but what first Moses and afterwards every high priest did, go and receive immediately from the mouth of God in Mount Sinai, in the tabernacle of the ark, and in the sanctum sanctorum of the temple. The sanctum sanctorum of the temple. And for the text in St. Matthew, I know the words in the gospel are not go teach, but go make disciples. And that there is a great difference between a subject and a disciple, and between teaching and commanding. But in such texts as these were to be so interpreted, why do not Christian kings lay down their titles of majesty and sovereignty and call themselves the Pope's lieutenants? But the doctors of the Romish Church seem to decline that title of absolute power. Absolute power in their distinction of power spiritual and temporal. But this distinction I do not very well understand. By spiritual power they mean the power to determine points of faith and to be judges in the inner court of conscience, of moral duties, virtues, and our power to punish those men that obey not their precepts by ecclesiastical censure, that is, by excommunication. And this power, they say, the Pope hath immediately from Christ, without dependence of any king or sovereign assembly, whose subjects they that stand excommunicate, but for the power temporal, which consists in judging and punishing those actions that are done against the civil laws, they say they do not pretend to it directly, but only indirectly. That is to say, so far forth as from actions tends to hindrance or advancement of religion and good manners, which they mean when they say in ordine ad spiritualite. In ordine ad spiritualia. What power then is left to kings and other civil sovereigns, which the Pope may not pretend to be in ordine ad spiritualia? None, or very little. And this power not only the Pope pretends to in all Christendom, but most bishops also in their several dioceses jure divino, that is, immediately quantum entangled with Christ, from Christ, without deriving it from the Pope. But what if a man refuse obedience to this pretended power of the Pope and his bishops? What harm can excommunication do him? Especially if he be the subject of another sovereign. Very great harm. For by the Pope's or bishop's signification of it to the civil power, he shall be punished sufficiently. He were in an ill case then that adventure to write or speak in defense of the civil power that must be punished by him whose rights be he defended, like Uzzah that was slain because he would needs unbidden put forth his hands to keep the ark from failing. But if a whole nation should revolt from the Pope at once, what effect could excommunication have upon the nation?